Okay, so classic gamer question. Let's pretend that you had the ability to pick any cantrip available in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and you could cast it anytime you wanted. Which cantrip would you pick, and why? There are obviously a ton of great options here, but I want to give a special shout out to musical accompaniment, which is a cantrip that allows you to be followed by orchestral music that adapts to whatever actions you happen to be taking. Is it practical? No, but is it amazing? You bet it is. Today, we're going to talk about how to run Pervasive Magic Campaigns in Pathfinder 2nd Edition on today's episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello travelers and tourists, my name is Mark and I am the local disaster tour guide. That's right, I am a storyteller that is more than happy to give all of the monsters in my Pathfinder 2e game access to the invisibility spell. All of them. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder, and welcome to a discussion of Pervasive Magic Campaigns in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. In any sort of fantasy TTRPG, the question of magic is always one of those elements of storytelling that is integral to designing the setting. It is one of the critical attributes that helps to distinguish a fantasy story from just a historical fiction story. There are a variety of different approaches that you can take to magic in a fantasy setting, ranging from the stock standard magical things that you see in games like Pathfinder and D&D, to low magic settings where magic exists but is very rare and hard to locate, all the way to extremely high magic settings where magic is functionally just an everyday convenience that everyone experiences and benefits from. There are a variety of different ways that you can use magic in a story, but in particular today, what I want to talk about is those high magic settings. How can you do a pervasive magic story in Pathfinder 2nd Edition? Now, in complete transparency, this video was not actually the video I was hoping to do this week. The video that I planned to have come out today, there was a minor delay in me being able to publish it. So hopefully next week, you're going to get some Howl of the Wild content from this channel, but I needed a little bit of filler content for this week. And as I was digging through the various books that I've picked up for Pathfinder 2e, I realized that there is a lot of content in Secrets of Magic that I've never really taken the time to properly dive into, and one of those options is Pervasive Magic, or how to tell a really high magic story in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Now, the content for today's video comes from pages 218 to 223 of Secrets of Magic. It's about 6 pages worth of information on running a Pervasive Magic campaign, although I'll go ahead and tell you that the majority of the content that you're really going to want to focus in on is found on the first 4 pages of that section. The last 2 pages is mostly just some setting options inside of Golarion that you could use this style of campaign. But what we're going to do today is we're going to take a look at the advice on how to run a Pervasive Magic campaign. I'm going to talk about some of the options that are presented, how they're used, and what players and storytellers should consider if they want to do an extremely high magic story in their campaign. So, with all that out of the way, let's get started. So, when it comes to running a Pervasive Magic campaign in Pathfinder 2e, there are essentially 4 steps that you need to consider. The first step is going to be a broad overview, a description of the major change to the setting that players and storytellers need to keep in mind, And then from there, really the next 3 steps are just kind of applying that principle to different aspects of the campaign world. As previously mentioned, this content does appear in Secrets of Magic, page 218 to 223, so this is about 6 pages of reading that you need to do to know how to adapt Pathfinder 2nd Edition to this style of story, but it's a pretty easy read and it's pretty easy to do. However, there is one thing I want to note at the top of this conversation, which is Secrets of Magic was released before the Pathfinder 2e Remaster. So as a result, that means that the Pervasive Magic chapter of Secrets of Magic is referencing the legacy version of the Pathfinder 2e rules. Naturally, that raises the question of, is this option even still usable in Pathfinder 2e? And the reality is, yes, and very easily so. Reading over the entire 6 pages and all of the content that Paizo gave us for adapting Pathfinder 2nd Edition, the reality is, adapting Pervasive Magic to the Remaster is incredibly simple. For the most part, you're just going to need to change a few traits here and there, and when we consider the sections on building PCs and building creatures, you just need to bear in mind that you want to use the remastered spells rather than the legacy spells, and that means on occasion you might need to switch out a legacy spell option for a remaster spell option, but that is pretty simple to do. So minus a few name changes here and there, and maybe switching out a spell option or two, the actual rules for Pervasive Magic are incredibly simple, and it all begins with step number 1, the biggest change that you need to know about a Pervasive Magic campaign setting is everything gets a magical trait of some kind. Yes, everything. The idea behind Pervasive Magic is magic abounds in the particular setting where this story is taking place, and as a result, every creature, whether you're talking PCs or monsters, and every location has some sort of magical trait that corresponds to the type of magic that is common in that area. Now, on the surface, that might seem like that is a lot to think about, and there are some implications we're going to dive into, but bear in mind that all magic in Pathfinder 2e can be divided into 4 traditions, and it is from those 4 traditions that the magical traits will be drawn. That means everything in the game is going to have a trait corresponding to one of the 4 magical traditions in Pathfinder 2e: Arcane, Divine, Occult, or Primal. And once you realize that the first step in applying the Pervasive Magic setting is just choosing one of those 4 traits, you realize that a lot of this work is going to be very straightforward. Are you adapting a location that is a natural environment, maybe a forest or a cave? Well, you're most likely going to give it the primal trait. Are your characters going to the local library? Then they're very likely to be in an area that has the arcane trait instead. Are they at the local temple? The divine trait seems appropriate. And have they traveled to a location where emotions tend to run high, such as maybe a concert hall? Well, the occult trait from the occult tradition is a perfect match. Not necessarily every location or creature is going to be a clean fit to one of these 4 traits, but the reality is a lot of them are going to be easy to decide and apply, and the opportunity to mix up those traits can very quickly create interesting story beats. Imagine, for example, a powerful animal that doesn't have the primal trait, the obvious choice for a beast to have, but instead has the arcane trait, the divine trait, or, dare I say, the occult trait. Even the simple act of switching what would be the obvious trait for a less obvious trait can very quickly lead to some interesting story beats, and the basics of creating the Pervasive Magic campaign setting is just thinking about what magical trait do creatures and locations have, and what do those traits imply or mean for the creatures and locations in question. So let's move on to step number 2 and talk about creating player characters in a Pervasive Magic campaign. I do want to note that the Pervasive Magic campaign setting rules do not use the free archetype rules that are very common and very well known in the Pathfinder 2e community. Now, as an experienced storyteller, I think that you could very easily merge Pervasive Magic and the free archetype rules into a single package for a campaign, and I think that that would work very naturally and very easily. But rules as written, Pervasive Magic is its own subsystem that is not related to free archetype in any way, so just be aware that those are two different things. As noted in step number 1, all creatures gain a magical trait of some kind, and this fact applies to player characters. When a player sits down to create a character for a Pervasive Magic campaign, they must choose one of the 4 spellcasting tradition traits to apply to their character. Again, Arcane, Divine, Occult, or Primal. This choice represents what kind of magic has had an impact on the character, possibly from the earliest moments of their life. Was your character blessed at the local temple on the day of their birth? Maybe they have the Divine trait just as a natural part of who they are. Is your character an academic who has spent most of their life inside of a school or at least a library? Maybe they've absorbed a lot of arcane magic and they have that trait instead. You pick one of the 4 traits we previously discussed, and your character automatically gains that trait. Now, this is where we create an important distinction. This trait that is being applied to your character is adding to your character, not restraining your character. Here in a moment, this trait that you've been given is going to open up some options for your character, but be aware that this choice in no way changes what other choices you can make as you are creating your character for this game. So, for example, let's say that your character was blessed as a child, and your character may have the Divine trait and the benefits that come from the Divine trait, but as your character grew up, they may have left the temple and moved on to a completely different career. Maybe they became a rogue or a fighter, or maybe they decided to study a completely separate magical tradition. Your character may have the Divine trait, and yet they may have trained as a druid and used primal magic as the main sort of magic that they command. The fact that your character has one trait in no way limits any of the other choices you make. This selection is on top of everything else and a way of giving your character some extra options they wouldn't normally have, and that extra option comes, at least at character creation, in the form of a cantrip associated with whichever spellcasting tradition your magical trait is drawn from. So, for example, if you have the Divine trait, you can choose any Divine cantrip that your character is able to cast. By the same token, if your character has the Primal trait, they get to choose one Primal cantrip to cast, and this cantrip is always available to you regardless of what other choices your character might make. Additionally, if your character's main class does not have access to the cast a spell activity, you gain access to the cast a spell activity so that by the rules you have the ability to use whichever cantrip you can access. And that right there covers the major difference for player characters in a Pervasive Magic campaign setting. Everyone gets a free cantrip that they know how to cast that comes from a tradition of magic that has, in one manner or another, influenced them. However, there are some additional options beyond this that you can potentially access in the form of Pervasive Magic backgrounds and Pervasive Magic feats. Now, the Pervasive Magic backgrounds, I want to go ahead and say, this is probably the most Game Master fiat aspect of the rules. The Pervasive Magic chapter offers 3 different special backgrounds representing the influence of magic in your character's life. These backgrounds are Energy Scarred, Mystic Tutor, and Surge Investigator. All 3 of the backgrounds do have the rare trait, which means it is very much up to Game Master discretion whether or not they want to include these backgrounds. Honestly, in my personal opinion, I think these backgrounds are probably reasonable to use. The only problem I have is there's only 3 options. I would have liked to have seen Paizo include some additional rare backgrounds to kind of go with this style of campaign, because I don't like the idea that there's only 3 options here, but I think that a solution for this, if you're a storyteller, would be to open up some other rare background options that you might find for Pathfinder 2e. For example, there are several options related to astrological signs in the Lost Omens travel guide. I think a lot of those backgrounds could fit very easily with a Pervasive Magic campaign, but at the end of the day, these Pervasive Magic backgrounds are an optional rules element that you don't necessarily have to use. They are just an option that's presented to further flesh out the influence of magic on your character. The next thing that's offered are a set of 4 Pervasive Magic Feats. And these 4 Pervasive Magic Feats are essentially bonus class feats that are added to whichever class you happen to be playing inside of the game. So if you're playing a fighter, you get 4 bonus class feats with the Pervasive Magic trait that you can take as long as you are the appropriate level as fighter class feats. However, if you're playing a druid, they become druid class feats. If you're playing an oracle, they're oracle class feats. And next year when the commander comes out, you can use them as commander class feats as well. They are essentially bonus options available to every class, and these 4 feats are all pretty simple to identify: cantrip casting, basic spellcasting, expert spellcasting, and master spellcasting. You may recognize the formula here as the multi-class spellcasting feats available anytime that you want to multi-class into a spellcasting archetype. Basic spellcasting is an option if you were to archetype into wizard or oracle or something like that. Well, essentially what the Pervasive Magic campaign setting does is it says every class has its own set of feats that allow them to access some magic, and these feats scale exactly as you would expect them to do in the normal archetype scenario. Cantrip casting is available at 2nd level, basic spellcasting is available at 4th level, expert spellcasting is available at 12th level, and master spellcasting is available at 18th level. The basic, expert, and master spellcasting feats are going to give you access to spell slots, and anytime you would gain a spell slot, they're also going to add a spell to your spell repertoire. What that means is these particular feats are going to follow the spellcasting formula for spontaneous spellcaster spellcasting feats. So these feats essentially will work the same way as a sorcerer archetype or a bard archetype. Any spontaneous spellcaster inside of Pathfinder 2e, if you were archetyping into one of those classes, these feats would work essentially the same way. But with that, we've actually covered all the modifications that go into creating a player character for a Pervasive Magic campaign. You get a trait associated with one of the magical traditions, you get access to cantrip and the ability to cast a spell, you pick your mental attribute that drives your spellcasting, and then you have access to some optional backgrounds and some optional class feats that can expand the influence of magic on your character, but beyond that, the rest of character creation remains the same, and you would just build out your character the way you would for any other Pathfinder 2e game. But that's just the player character side of the coin. Let's move on to step number 3 and talk about creatures, because if the player characters get some new magical tricks, then the monsters that they're dealing with should get some new magical tricks as well. And I want to emphasize for storytellers, the process of doing this is relatively simple, but the implications of doing this should really be one of those things that just makes your evil GM heart cackle with glee, because yes, there's a lot of fun to be had here. The actual process of updating creatures for a Pervasive Magic campaign is pretty simple. All creatures get a trait, we've already talked about that, and then they get one spell. Yeah, that's it. You're going to pick a single spell that a creature knows how to cast and add that to the creature stat block. Now, you may be asking yourself, why is it one spell? And the answer is this: creatures don't live long. From a storytelling perspective, the monsters that you introduce to the game are obstacles for your players to deal with. They are challenges that your players have to face. But the typical monster, once it drops onto the battle mat at your gaming table, it's going to be lucky if it's there for a total of 10 rounds, And during that time, it's got plenty of things that it needs to do and plenty of abilities that it already has access to. So from a storytelling game design perspective, adding a single spell that the creature can use to add some new tactic or dimension to the encounter, that's actually a very significant change. As a storyteller, you don't need to go much further than that. So as a storyteller, what you're going to do is pick a single trait associated with a spellcasting tradition, and then there are 4 tables in Secrets of Magic that correspond to those traditions, and they just give you a list of different spells that you can pick, and the spells have already been curated by the level of creature that you might be dealing with. So for example, let's say that you're throwing your party up against a 9th level monster and you decide to give that 9th level monster the occult trait. Well, you would go to the table, look at the occult tradition list, go to the 9th level monsters, and so you could pick one of the spells such as Confusion, that's one of the ones on the list, and add Confusion to the stat block for your monster. Also, it's worth noting when you look at these tables that you can pick any spell at that creature's level or before. So in the case of the occult tradition list, if you didn't want to use Confusion, which is one of the highest level spells available, you could use an earlier spell like Haste, Paranoia, or Ghost Sound. You just look at the spell list, pick one of the options, and add it to the character sheet. Of course, once you pick the spell, the creature will gain the cast a spell activity just like player characters did. And then you'll need to figure out the spell attack and spell DC of whatever spell you just gave the creature, and the cool thing about these tables are, they've already filled that out for you. So really when it comes to upgrading creatures for a Pervasive Magic campaign, Paizo has made it about as easy as it could possibly be. Pick a tradition, check the list, pick a spell, throw the appropriate spell attack or spell DC on the monster stat block, and congratulations, you're good to go. You have a fully upgraded monster. So now let's talk about the final step that you want to think about if you're a storyteller, and that is how to modify locations. Now the reality is, modifying locations for a Pervasive Magic campaign is going to be very similar to just developing locations for a standard TTRPG. As a storyteller, you think about where you want the story to go, what you want your players to see, and what the effects of that terrain or location might be. The only super specific thing in updating locations for a Pervasive Magic campaign is the step we've already talked about for player characters and creatures, which is choosing which magical trait is going to be associated with a given location. Most of the time, the trait that you would pick is going to be pretty obvious. And really from there, not a lot else is going to change, except maybe a little bit of set dressing about how you describe the environment. As the players walk through town, maybe there are magical lamps all over the place, or maybe they see people who are cleaning the streets and keeping up the environment using magical means rather than mundane means, but for the most part, all you're going to be doing is slapping a magical label onto whatever location your players happen to be. However, that discussion of flavor text leads us to an important consideration as a storyteller. When you run a Pathfinder 2e game, having cool locations is imperative. Having cool locations is important to the story. You want to have some good set dressing for wherever it is your players are going to go and whatever it is that your players are going to do. Having an epic fight scene is cool. Having an epic fight scene on an airship as it plummets to the ground is cooler. Location can very easily elevate a story, and when you think about a Pervasive Magic campaign, essentially what you want to ask is, how do I crank this up a bit? Most of the time it's going to be flavor text of the setting, and you don't have to worry too much about it, but in the Pervasive Magic section of Secrets of Magic, one of the things that Paizo presents is what is known as magical terrain. Essentially, these are some quick modifiers you can throw onto particular locations to really help emphasize just how much magic is present in that location. In particular, Paizo gives us 6 examples, though one of the examples is actually technically 2 different examples. We'll get into it. Paizo gives us some quick modifiers that a storyteller can use to create magical terrain. and they are all pretty easy to apply, and on top of that, they create a framework for other magical terrain that you might develop as a storyteller. So really quick, let's talk about the magical terrain examples that Paizo gives us. First up is the energy surge terrain, and when you add energy surge to a location, you just pick a particular type of energy, fire, electricity, acid, you could use vitality or void, it doesn't matter, you just pick a particular type of energy, and anytime someone casts a spell that has that trait and it deals that kind of damage, you just add 1d6 of the appropriate damage type to the spell cast. If you have a particular magical terrain where fire is surging through the area, if someone were to cast the fireball spell, they get to add an extra d6 of fire damage to the damage of the spell. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. The next option that's presented is called Heightened Terrain, and this corresponds to the Heightening Spells rules that you find in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Some spells come with an effect that when you heighten them, whether it's by 1 spell rank or 2 spell ranks, whatever the case may be, they get more powerful or additional effects as a result. So, Heightened Terrain is basically terrain that is going to heighten certain spells. Again, much like the Energy Surge terrain, what you want to do is you want to pick a particular trait. This trait can be as narrow as an energy trait like we discussed before, or it could be something broader like an actual entire magical tradition. For example, maybe an important temple has the heightened divine trait, and any divine spell cast within that area automatically benefits from the terrain, and the effect here is pretty simple. You just heighten the spell rank of any spell with that trait by +1. You don't have to chase a lot of different information here, it stays pretty simple. Whatever spell rank the appropriate spell is cast at, you just add 1 to it and gain whatever the appropriate effects might be. So for example, if a cleric were to use a Divine Lance spell in the aforementioned temple, and it was being cast at a 2nd rank, well, because it meets the appropriate traits, you heighten it by +1, and it gains the effects as if it was a 3rd rank spell instead. The next type of magical terrain that's mentioned is going to be our first actual example of having to rename something for the remaster. Originally, Secrets of Magic discussed the metamagic terrain, but we need to change that to the spell-shaped terrain instead. However, the effects here are pretty simple. Either any spell or any spell with an appropriate trait that you choose automatically benefits from the spell-shaped feat of your choice. Most often, it's either going to be the Reach or Widen spell-shaped feat. Though, as a storyteller, you could pick any other spell-shaped feat that you thought was appropriate. You just decide what spells are affected, and any spell that would be affected gains the appropriate spell-shaped feat whenever it's cast. There is a little bit of a note with this particular terrain, in that if a character chooses to add their own spell-shaped feat to a spell that they cast in this area, whatever spell-shaped feat they use overrides whatever benefit the terrain would normally give them. So in other words, you don't get to stack spell-shaped feats just because of the terrain. The next 2 types of magical terrain that Secrets of Magic discusses are the Occult Terrain and the Primal Terrain. And with both of these, what they're going to do is anytime you cast a spell of the appropriate tradition, you're going to gain a minor buff that lasts until the end of your next turn. With the Occult Terrain, anytime a creature casts an occult spell, they gain a +1 bonus to their will saves and to any charisma-based skill check that they make until the end of their next turn. As for the Primal Terrain, anytime a creature casts a primal spell, they gain a +10 foot bonus to their speed. Basically, in both cases, it's an easy, minor, simple to apply buff that characters get to benefit anytime they use the right kind of magic. Now I will note here, Secrets of Magic does not give us an example of arcane terrain or divine terrain, but I think this is something that you could pretty easily do as a storyteller. Off the top of my head, I thought of arcane terrain could give you a bonus on recall knowledge checks or identifying spells. And divine terrain might give you a small defensive bonus to your AC or possibly a small bit of fast healing for 1 round. Really, as a storyteller, when it comes to any of the 4 traditions, as long as the effect is appropriate to the tradition, it's not too hard to add in. The final option that's mentioned is called Spell Touch Terrain, and this comes in 2 flavors, permanent and periodic. In a permanent Spell Touch Terrain, anyone who is in that terrain and meets a certain criteria is automatically affected by a particular spell. So for example, you could have a permanent safety feature around a tower where anyone who begins to fall is affected by a gentle landing spell. As a storyteller, you just decide what spell is permanently in effect in the area and what triggers the application of the spell, and there you go. It's easy to use. The other option presented here is the periodic Spell Touch Terrain, and this means that a particular spell hits the area at certain intervals. This, I think, is intended more to be hazardous terrain, such as you have to be careful when you move through the area because you never know when a fireball or a lightning bolt might surge through the area. But regardless of what spell you use, it's the periodic and reliable timing of the spell that helps set it apart as Spell Touch Terrain. These are the examples that Paizo gives in Secrets of Magic, but as a storyteller, I think it's pretty obvious the framework here. Adding some minor magical bonuses to a setting can help emphasize just how much magical energy is surging through the area. So don't feel limited by these options. By all means, feel free to create your own. Adding magical effects to the terrain or the location is an easy way to help set things apart in a Pervasive Magic campaign. But congratulations, we've now covered all of the steps necessary to modify a Pathfinder 2nd Edition game to help tell a truly high magic story and make a Pervasive Magic campaign possible. Now, I did note that there are a couple of pages that I haven't really covered in this video. At the end of this section, Paizo talks about several of the locations in the Golarion campaign setting where a Pervasive Magic campaign might be appropriate. They talk about locations like the Starstone Cathedral or the Socorus Scar. They mention places like Darkmoon Vale and Nidal, or nations like Geb and Nex. Different locations like that are a natural place to set a Pervasive Magic campaign, but don't feel limited to those options. Obviously, as a storyteller, allowing for a great influx of magic into an area is almost its own story hook by itself. You could take a region of Golarion that is normally a very standard region, and then suddenly some sort of magical phenomenon occurs and everyone has access to magic. That scenario is a pretty obvious story hook, and many people would want to know, hey, why is this happening? So the last portion of this conversation about Pervasive Magic, where Paizo says, these are some locations in Golarion you can use. If you need the inspiration, that is available, but don't feel constrained to just those options, because this is truly a style of story that you can drop anywhere you see fit. But that brings us to the end of the discussion of Pervasive Magic that Paizo presents in Secrets of Magic, so the time has come for me to turn the conversation over to you. Have you had the opportunity to play in a Pervasive Magic story in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, or possibly in some other TTRPG? Jump down to the comments section and let me know how that campaign went and what advice you might have for someone who wants to try that style of story. Also, if this kind of campaign sounds interesting to you, let me know how you might use this style of story as a GM, or how your character might be influenced by a sudden surge of magic if they were to find themselves in this particular type of tale. Yes, that does mean that I'm asking you to do all of the stuff that helps to support the channel. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. You can check out my free Discord, my Patreon. All of the links to that kind of stuff will be in the video description below, and I'm also going to throw a link to the Pervasive Magic rules from Secrets of Magic. I'm going to throw a link to that on Archives of Nethys into the video description as well. But please remember that the best thing you can do to help support this channel is join in the conversation, because I absolutely love to hear from you all, and getting to talk to you all is the best part of this job. So, as always, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being part of the conversation. Have a wonderful day.